So last week we went through the history of type, and we kind of went through the different eras and how things changed based on technology, what was available to them, if the pen nibs were getting better, paper was getting smoother, they could have more thick and thin lines, the creation of sans serif type, all of that through display type and slab serif type. So type family classifications is chapter 3 in your book, and there's tons of examples. So it's great if you have the book with you to be flipping through as we hit these different type families. So some terminology that you need to be aware of are typeface, font, type style, and type family. You guys think there's a difference between typeface and font? Tend to use them kind of interchangeably because we're just talking and not thinking. Did font exist 50 years ago? No, because font is what? The computer version, right? So the typefaces, but there's also a difference here that we're going to learn about right away. Do you want me to share the screen? Let's see a little bit better. That didn't work, did it? Or did it?
No, it's away.
Well, mine turned off on mine because
you were about
the computer started falling asleep.
Okay. Continue. Okay. No? Yes, no. Everybody have it that needs it?
Yep.
You're kind of close enough. Are you okay? Oh, yeah, there you go. The big screen right there. So, type terminology. Let's go to the next slide here. So, typeface. This refers to all the letter forms that have been especially designed by a designer for specific use. In theory, this could just be a few letters. So you have a client, and their name is Country Cookin' Cabbage. They want you to make something brand new for them. They want a typeface. They don't want to use any of the fonts that exist in the world. None of them are good. You make one. Right? So for sure, you're making the letter C, capital letter C. You're going to make a lowercase o. It's going to take care of those. A lowercase u, n. That's going to take care of those. T, you need an R, a Y, a K, an I, an A, G, E, and you need that little D. So that's all you need. Is that 26 letters of the alphabet? That's certainly not all capitals and lowercase. That's all you need to do. So if that's what you do, that's your starting point. Where's the red? Used to wipe this off? Seriously. I just used it. God. There it is. Okay. All right, now when we start talking about the digitized version, or if that person loved it, you would go and make the whole type family then. But the font specifically is a collection of all the characters of the specific typeface that are necessary for typesetting. So you have to make all the capital letters, all the lowercase, all the numbers, all the special symbols, all the punctuation, accents, anything and everything. So page 64 in your book shows a picture of, what is it? Times New Roman, but here's the complete font map for Myriad Web Pro Bold. So it's more than just 26 caps and 26 lower letters in 0 through 9. There's a lot of other things that have to be designed to go with this family. So this is the complete font for that specific Myriad Web Pro Bold. Okay, the next part is the style. The type style refers to the way a typeface has been modified. So there's the basic, Franklin Gothic, or book might be the basic one. But then there could be demi-condensed, Gothic heavy, Gothic medium, italics, condensed, bold. You guys know this, right? There are some that have 12 to 15 different type styles of that one font. That's awesome because it really makes it easy to mix and do a whole design in just one family. But like this could be your headline. This could be the body copy. You could use, if there's other options, you could use the italicized version when you need it. So the style is the way that it's been modified. And then the type family is a collection of a typeface and all of the styles. So that Franklin Gothic, that could be a family. You have bold, condensed, yada, yada, yada. It also means, and this is a little bit confusing, the type family refers to the category that you could classify it into. So Is this old style? Is this black letter? Is this slab serif? What family does it fit into of those 9 main families? Those are both correct usage of the word type family. So if somebody said, I want a type family that has like 12 different options within it because I'm going to need some heavy and some condensed, that's correct. Or if they say, this comes from the type family of black letter, that's also correct. It's 2 different versions of using it that are both correct. Okay, some standard fonts that you guys have all seen and should know. All right, so the type family categories, this is kind of based on last week's talk about going through the history of time. They're based, or they reflect their historical origins, what's going on at the time, what they have to use for tools to do it, and stylistic qualities. So why does this matter? If you understand what family it falls into, it's going to give a certain vibe, if that's the right word. We looked at that earlier with the signage. So it's going to help you decide when to use a certain font choice or a typeface choice. It's going to be a better design overall. So the construction truck in Comic Sans, not a strong decision. A funeral home set in chiller font, not a good decision. A funeral home set in all black letter. Depending on what it looks like, it could look really old and trusted, been around since the 1600s, or it could look kind of creepy because that black letter kind of sometimes has a creepy notation, like the plague. Mm-hmm. So here's our 9 family categories, and we're going to be able to, in this class, real soon in groups, figure out if I give you a font printed out, you're going to assign it one of these 9. So black letter, humanist, old style, transitional, modern, Egyptian, which is also slab serif, that's when the feet are like bricks. Sans serif, that's an easy one to pick out. Script and display. So by the time you get to about these bottom few, they're pretty easy to pick out. I think you could probably do that right now. These are the ones, well, black letter's pretty easy overall, but right in here, these are kind of hard to tell what family they fall into. So we're going to look for some very specifics, and we're going to start with black letter. And again, in your book, I'm just going to pop to this quick on the dot cam. Each chunk here starts with the tendencies and what to look for. So this can be super helpful if you pop to that page in the book. So black letter type was based on the handwriting of the German and Irish scribes of the time. They used wide-nibbed pens, so letters had a very sharp, angular look. The downstroke was thick, and as they went over, it was very angular and thin. To conserve parchment, or the paper that they were using at the time, was very expensive, so they drew very narrow letters so they could ram as many words on a sheet as possible. And then when you looked at this from afar, the lack of negative spaces gave the page an overall appearance of being really dark. There's just tons of black ink all on it, so that's where the name black letter came from. Here's some examples. And in the book, if you flip through, you see a whole bunch of examples showing what they look like. If you look at page 68, that very next page, yep, at the bottom, that type style, it doesn't exactly look as black letter as the ones on the opposite page from it. It looks a little bit more rounded and open, but that's still black letter type. All right, then we move on to the next era, and we have the humanist type family. So page 71 in your book has the specifics about that as far as what the terminals look like, what the angle of stress is, the amount of contrast and proportion, so how to pick it out. So the scribes in Italy were not using that black letter style of the day. They had a more open and airy style, so when you looked at the sheet from afar, it was much more white space, so they called it white letter. Easier to read than black letter. Black letter was so condensed and very heavy. So there's more humanistic qualities to the letters. They have a soft, handwritten, organic feel, and the crossbar on the lowercase e is almost always slanted. So I'm going to just put that right here. So it's like this. A-N-I-S-T. So that's a feature that if you have a lowercase letter e, It's going to really help you see that crossbar. Also on that page, you can see that the angle of stress is usually oblique. It's tilted towards the left from the baseline. A low contrast between thick and thin strokes. The X height is generally medium to tall. Bump forward here. So the X height is where that halfway point is. It's either at or above that halfway point for the X height. Here's the angle in the sloped E that makes it very easy to pick out that this is humanist. And it's more open and airy than blackface for sure, much easier to read. All right, then there's a bunch of examples in the book. We get to Old Style Type Family, which is on page 80. So at first, when they came out with printed books, people thought that they were inferior, that the hand-lettered ones were better. They just didn't like the change. We talked about how the change was always a struggle for people. But once people started to accept printed books, they also didn't need or expect it to look so hand-drawn. So old style letters started looking less like calligraphy. They looked a little bit more precise, lighter, and they had more contrast between the thick and thin strokes. So the old style type tendencies on page 80, moderately oblique, and the contrast, there's low to medium contrast. If we scroll down here, another thing that helps you pick this one out is that the ascenders, like well, anything that's an ascender, go above the cap height. So this is definitely a clue to old style, is that the ascenders go higher. So in this hand glovery, if I could draw that line across there, you can see how the ascenders are up higher. So that's a good clue when you're looking at different fonts that it comes from this family. Also at this point, the crossbar in the lower shape E becomes horizontal. We don't have this angle anymore. And this style hung around for about 200 years. Then we get into the transitional type family, page 90 in your book. There's a lot of technological advancements in printing. That Roman Drouais was the first transitional typeface that was commissioned by King Louis. We have a more vertical angle of stress, not that oblique. We're not tipped anymore, and more contrast is coming into play. So here's an example. You definitely see that the stress point, like on the E, the thinnest area is at the 12 o'clock and down here, not at that angle like it had been. So the angle of stress is more vertical. Again, if you look at the book on page 90, medium contrast between thick and thin strokes. The X height is generally medium in relationship to the capital letters. The set width is the characters tend to be a little bit more narrow than old style type and more precise. But the helpful hint here is when the ascenders go up higher than the cap line. That's when you know you're in this family. Then, whoops, we get into modern, page 99. This is the Roman typefaces that were developed in the late 1700s and 1800s. These are actually pretty easy to pick out because they have very narrow set width, the letters are narrow, lots of contrast, and short X height. That's probably the easiest thing to pick out on the modern family. So if we look at Bernhard Modern, you see how small this is? The X height, how tiny it is? Excuse me. Vertical stress, but definitely this lower X height makes that something that you can pick out pretty easily. Excuse me. So modern, an easy tip here is the lower X height, or smaller. All right, Egyptian or slab serif type family comes into play on page 108 in your book. This emerges as a display type in the Victorian ads in the 1800s. Very easy to recognize because of the heavy squared off serifs and the chunky appearance. very low contrast. So all of the lines are pretty much the same weight. Claridon, some of these parts are a little bit thinner, but most of the time the weight is the same all the way throughout, and that the serifs are like bricks. They're not thin, they don't have angles, they're not stylized, they're just bricks. This one's quite easy to pick out. Some differences in serifs. Again, if you're looking at these different old style to transitional to modern to slab, old style serifs, you can see how they're kind of rounded on the edges here. When we get to transitional, they're a little bit more chiseled out. They're not rounded up, they're kind of rounded in. We get to modern, there's no round anymore, it's just a straight slab out and then slab. A straight serif, and then when we get to slabs, it's a brick. It's very easy to pick out. All right, the sans serif type family. Also very easy to pick out because there's no serifs. So remember, this was not popular at first. It existed prior to the 1900s, but it wasn't popular, and because of that, any design that had no serifs, it was sans serif, was considered ugly or grotesque. So there's actually a family called grotesque sans serif. That's stuff before the 1900s. So when they took these off the little feet, the little serifs, designers are creating typefaces that express experiences in a new, fast-paced world. So the three different categories, if you're in your book on page 118, we see all three: grotesque, geometric, and humanist. So if it was designed before the 20th century, or it's a digital version based on that, it's the grotesque category. The geometrics are based on the shapes, or based on shapes and are very wide set. And the humanist sans serif are based on the humanist type and the proportions of that. So some very easy ways to tell which version of sans serif it is to look at the letters A and G, the capitals and the lower cases. And again, on your book, in your book, on this page, we can see some of the differences. In the geometric A's, the geometrics are right here, sorry. They're very boxy or rectangular. They're based on geometric shapes. The grotesque over here, and then the humanist on this side. So for all of them, how you can tell which category they fall into, if you look further down on the page, they talk about proportions of the X height and the set width. And then if there's any additional feature that's going to help you figure it out. So the apex of a capital letter A is usually squared off. So if we look up here, we can see how it's not pointy. If we get into it close enough, that is not a pointy apex. So here are some sans serif fonts. This is a lovely pun in the typography world. There's t-shirts and things that you can get if you're a typography nerd. I shot the serif. All right, next up is the script family, designed to look like they're handwritten. This does not mean cursive all the time. They can look hand-lettered, they can look brush-styled, some connect, others do not. So here is from the script family. There's tons of them. They're easy to pick out, I would say. So they're meant to look handwritten. And then display type on page 138 in your book. We talked about how when advertising, the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden we have products and things to sell. So now we need display type. So the invention of wood type made these novelty typefaces even cheaper to produce. We could have great big letter ends that weren't made out of lead. And then later on, when the computers came about and the digital revolution, we actually had fonts. So there's a flood of new and novel typefaces. So they go back and find old ones and create them digitally or make new ones. So these are used for decorative and attention-grabbing purposes only, which means small doses. So again, you can imagine you don't want things typeset this way and have to read your whole chapter in the book in this font. Not good. So over time, letter forms have undergone physical changes that reflected the technology changing, things that were going on politically and socially and economically, and just changing tastes, what people liked different. Okay, why do you need to know this? Because you need to make an educated decision on what typeface you're going to use for your projects. It can influence mood, memories, and suggest a historical era. So you have to be smart with your choices. Blending type families. Using the wrong fonts ain't cool, says Fonzie instead of Fonzie. Again, this is like the construction truck with Comic Sans on it. Speaking of Comic Sans, please keep the door closed. And then somebody put up a sign, this is the passive-aggressive stuff at work, right? Please don't use Comic Sans. We are a Fortune 500 company, not a lemonade stand. This one kills me. Sex offender registration office in Comic Sans. No, no. Would I vote for Gail Sheehan based on this sign? No.
Real.
Yeah.
Oh, Gail. All right. Here are the fonts envisioned as dogs. Poor Comic Sans. Kind of feel bad for the little guy, right? But it's kind of funny to see what they look like, how you would picture them as dogs. I'm going to show you a video next week, I think, of the fonts as people, what they look like. It's very funny. All right. If you're going to mix types, so you have to have a headline and then your body copy. This happens all the time. Look in magazines, look in your book. In our book, what are our headlines written in versus, or the subheads versus the body copy? What's the body copy? You don't need to give me a historical thing. It's just what?
The part that has the most words.
Yeah. And what is in our book, literally, what is it? Serif or sans serif? Oh, I guess the main body copy in this book is serif type. There's little feet on it all. That's easier for reading. It actually helps guide your eye across. The headlines, or the little subheads that I see that are in red, are sans serif. So they've mixed the two together. So that's pretty common, is mixing the two together. So you need to pay attention to scale and proportion. When you mix and match, you're going to use font styles that make sense with the existing weight and emphasis. Make a heavier font oblique, italic to de-emphasize its weight. So there's things that you can do to make them look good together. So here's an example of a web layout that has a lot of script, but then we have a clean serif, can't tell. Sans serif in our navigation up here, but down here the type is serif, the body type. Pay attention to priority and emphasis of different fonts. So quick glance at this graphic, where does your eye go first? And we're going to have different answers, so just tell me where your eye goes first. What do you see first? You see the words right here. Okay, what do you see first, Sadie?
The events.
This part? Okay, your eye goes here. What do you see first?
Our hearts beat louder.
This
And the heart, yeah.
And the heart? Okay. So why are we going to these areas versus this and this?
Old text.
Bold, larger, right. So some fonts are going to draw more attention than others. This is why using multiple fonts is both incredibly fun and very hard to get right. We're going to do that later in this class, where you intentionally are going to have to use a bunch of different fonts on a poster and make it look good. Avoid anything that's too similar when you mix fonts. So you wouldn't use Georgia and Garamond right next to each other. This is Georgia, this is Garamond. Well, I used two fonts. You can't be mad at me. Well, they look exactly the same. That doesn't cut it for variety. Make sure that you keep your body text readable. Keep the funky typography for headlines or web navigation. That's easy. Again, don't overlook the different font styles. So if that family has bolds and demi and condensed and italic, you can go with one font family completely and just use different styles of it on that page and have something like you see here. Trust your instincts, take a step back and look at it. If it doesn't look right, Try it again. So here are just some examples of a variety of different, a very stylized script being used as the headers on this web page. All right, I'm going to stop right there. On the back of your ARC and one of those sheets, you have a Mixing Families worksheet. Flip that over, and there's not one exclusive right answer to this, but there are some that could be wrong. So typically you pair a serif with a sans serif, or something swirly with something very readable, or something thick with something very thin. So on this worksheet, go ahead and draw a line connecting how you would choose to pair these up. So if you had to use Giddy Up on your page, which one of those options from the right-hand side would be a good body copy? And let's go ahead and connect them. There's not a perfect answer. There's just some kind of wrong answers every now and then.